Hello there! Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and so enjoying this fabulous story. And if you haven't heard part 1, part 2 and part 3, please go back to listen to the story because you don't want to miss out on it. So let's continue with part 4 of our story. Chester's account. No one was more surprised than I was by the way my sister and her friend Wendy were behaving at breakfast the following morning. They were acting strangely, and Wendy had a smile on her face that was so wide, I was surprised it actually fit on her face. The only way I can describe that look is as if someone has won the lottery and they're thrilled to bits, but have reservations about telling you their great news. I knew what my sister and friend were getting up to every night. I wasn't an idiot. I would hear them tiptoeing past my bedroom, and it did leave me feeling rather bemused. I did not think it was prudently wise for my sister to be going out in the middle of the night with Wendy in the wistful, far-fetched, fanciful hope that they'd spot a spurious ghost ship that likely doesn't even exist. I'd never heard anything more ridiculous in my entire life, but I knew better than to put a spanner in the works and crush their dreams. That would be a cruel, rather heartless thing to do. It would be rather like telling a toddler, "Sorry, mate, Father Christmas isn't real." Can you imagine the devastated look on that toddler's face when all his images of Father Christmas climbing down the chimney to give him a Christmas stocking are cruelly shattered? In my humble opinion, it was one thing to hope they'd encounter a ghost of some poor beleaguered lost soul, wandering aimlessly along the beach, probably not even knowing they were dead, of which there was a distinct possibility, given the location of where we live, and the souls that have currently and very tragically lost their lives from both the past and in recent years. It's quite another to think that they'd encounter a ghost ship. I knew Wendy was absolutely determined to spot this ghost ship, so much so that every night she spent at the Cliff House with us, those two girls would resolutely be venturing out at the dead of night to look for this ship. It was like looking for a proverbial needle in a haystack. They told me they'd met a lovable old man on the beach who had seen the ghost ship 20 years before, and I will admit that did give me pause for thought. I discussed the idiosyncratic subject with a friend of mine who thought that it could be a glitch in our time-space when a traumatic event is replayed again. I didn't believe the old man was making the story up, but what I did believe was that my sister and her friend Wendy were grasping at straws in the pursuit of seeing this ghost ship for themselves. That old man had been trying to see a sighting of the ship for years and years, and his efforts, with the exception of one occasion, had been completely fruitless. What were the chances of my sister and her friends seeing it for themselves? Wendy was the most unusual, outlandish girl that I'd ever had the pleasure to meet. She was so unconventional and didn't care what the hell you thought about her, which made me like her all the more. She'd tell you exactly what was on her mind without apology. She had strong opinions, especially when it came to politics, and I knew if she ever got to be a leader one day, she'd cut all the crap. She'd be the type of person you'd vote for because she'd get things done, and she'd cut our taxes, making sure that people were not exploited financially, as she believes we're being robbed blind by our governments, and I'm in great agreement of that fact. A lot of young people feel like I do, and that we should have a say on how our taxes are spent, at the very least. Even my parents described her as one of life's movers and shakers. She was a positive influence on my sister, but I wasn't entirely sure these nightly trips to the beach were a good idea. I was torn between a rock and a hard place. I knew it would be treacherous for me to tittle-tale on what the two of them were getting up to at night, and for once in my life I will admit I was tempted to do just that, as I was grievously concerned of the safety of my sister and her friend. If my mother even had the slightest clue about their mischievous nightly soirees, she'd be freaking out, but my father would be insouciantly nonchalant about it all. Nothing ever troubled my dad. He was as perennially easy-going as the alpine flowers growing breezily on a mountain slope. Nothing phased my father, who took life in what I can only describe as a casual, enviable stride. My mother did have grievous concerns about how precariously treacherous the cliff was, and let's just say we had entertained several people in our home who had very nearly thrown themselves off the cliff, but thanks to my father, they had chosen to live. My father would bring them back to the cliff house and offer them coffee or a stiff brandy, and the police were always cordially invited to sit around our breakfast table in our cosy kitchen, and very often the person who had been about to take their own lives left our home in a police car with a decisive skip in their step, like people who were looking forward to embracing the rest of their lives, when only moments before they wanted to throw themselves off the cliff. My father Malachi had been a proficient, highly skilled used car salesman when he was only 18 years old, and no one had sold more cars than he did when he worked at the dealership. If anyone could persuade someone not to throw themselves off the cliff, it was my dad. Even the police, mesmerized by my father's abilities, were asking him for tips on how to persuade people to change their minds about jumping off the cliff to their deaths. I thought my parents were crazy to buy a house like this, but when we moved here, I understood why they bought the cliff house. My mother described it as being on top of the world, and it definitely is. I think the cliff house is the most beautiful house in these parts. It's simplistic and classic, with enviable, prepossessing views. I have no time for these grandiose mansions competing against each other for the pretentious X factor on the mountain slope. For me personally, I prefer the simpler things in life, and I believe unequivocally that less is always more. I'd loathe to be swallowed whole by the accumulation of so much stuff. I know there's a man with a grandiose mansion on the mountain slope who has over 45 fancy cars in his garage. I've seen him before leaving his property in one of his rather swanky, flashy cars, and I can tell you this, you can see at a brief glance he's not remotely happy. My mother saw him in town once, loading his trolley with caviar and langoustines, with a face on him so miserable it would make milk curdle, and when she tried to smile at him, he returned her smile with a formidable scowl. Not a nice man, I'm afraid. Anyway, going back to the subject of my sister's tireless pursuit of the ghost ship, I do remember the previous night very well. It had been incredibly windy, so much so that the entire cliff house began to rattle and shake. The wind can get frisky and rather treacherous when the cliff house is nestled on top of the cliff. You can be more exposed than any of the houses on the mountain slope that are protected by a considerable windbreak, the mountain itself, of course. Suffice to say, I nearly had a coronary arrest when I heard Wendy and my sister clandestinely creeping past my bedroom at the dead of night. Those two always think they're so incredibly clever, but I always know what my sister is getting up to. I'm like a crow with a beady eye, watching all their comings and goings, and not missing a trick. With the wind howling outside like a cantankerous old man, I sat up in my bed with a start. You've got to be kidding me. My sister and her friend Wendy were not evacuating our house at this time of night with the weather so grim. It was practically blowing a gale outside. Surely they weren't going to attempt climbing down the steps in the cliff in pretentious weather like this. If they weren't sagaciously careful, they could be blown over the cliff to their deaths. What the hell was wrong with them? Had they lost complete leave of their senses? I even heard my sister whispering to Wendy, "Are you sure it's a good idea? Listen to the howling wind." I could hear Wendy telling my sister to get a grip and to stop being such a baby. I bet that went down with my sister like a lead balloon. But Wendy being Wendy could get away with calling you anything, and you'd swallow her opinion with a rather big lump at the back of your throat, and find yourself persuaded to do whatever Wendy wanted you to do. I had in mind to put my foot down and pounce on the two unsuspecting girls, to say, "Enough is enough. You two are not going out of the house in the middle of the night like this, with a wind blowing like that outside. And if you dare do it, I'm going to wake up Mum and spill the beans." But somehow I couldn't betray my sister's trust. She'd always been faithful to me. Thank God that soon after they had left the cliff house, it wasn't long before the wind died down, so I could breathe a little easier, and I persuaded myself they'd be all right. Wendy was so agile. She was like a cat. I've seen her nimbly balance on a thin pole before. So it was not on Wendy where my concerns were rested. I'm afraid Hannah is rather ungainly, the kind of girl who's always tripping over her own shoelaces. I often wonder why those two are hard and fast friends, given that they are so different. But you know what they say, even in friendships, opposites attract. Ostensibly, my mother was surprised to see both Wendy and Hannah up so early for breakfast the following morning. They were behaving more than a little strangely, nudging each other, giggling and whistling, like a couple of juvenile kids that had a scandalous secret that they were not willing to share. I will admit I felt rather annoyed with them, as their silly giggling was not something I welcomed first thing in the morning, when I was feeling rather cranky myself. The family had got used to Wendy and Hannah sleeping way late in the morning. My mother thought it was typical behaviour of teenagers, but I knew differently. It was their nocturnal activities on the beach at night that was the cause of their late rising every morning. But I generously always said nothing. However, it was on this morning that there was an ebullience in the air between the both of them, that I could taste as sharply as the sea salt in the air. My mother Leonora, on seeing that the two girls were up and about, decided to make blueberry pancakes for breakfast. Even she could sense something was up, as she was flipping pancakes in the pan over the gas hob. She stared at both Wendy and Hannah with a raised brow. When she brought the pancakes over to the breakfast table, dribbling with maple syrup, and we all helped ourselves, she said candidly, "Spill, Wendy. What are the two of you secretly whispering about? You both look like the cat that got the cream, and more besides. I will not rest until you tell us what you're hiding from us, so spill, or forget having any more pancakes." "If I told you, Lenora, you wouldn't believe me," said Wendy, shrugging her shoulders. "So what would be the point anyway? But something wonderful happened to us that has blown our minds, that's all." "Let's see," said my mother, with a note of sarcasm in her voice. "You're going to tell me you saw the ghost ship last night, are you?" she said with a mischievous twinkle in her eye. I had no idea why she said that. Maybe it was because Wendy talked about the ghost ship so much, and how much she wanted to see it, and had told my mother about the old man that they'd met on the beach, who had taken them to his home for tea, and told them about his sighting of the ghost ship. My mother was blown away by the old man's story, and kept saying, "Well, I never! What an extraordinary story! What do you think, Malachi?" My father had said, "It sounds like the old man got to see something quite remarkable." "We want to see it too," Wendy had chided excitedly, and I remember thinking, "Sorry, girl, that's not going to happen to you." But of course, I politely withheld my private opinion. Never in a month of Sundays did I think that I would be eating up my words for breakfast, along with a bowl of Cheerios and some blueberry pancakes, dribbling with maple syrup, that I barely tasted that morning, which is a first, I hasten to say. I will never forget the befuddled expressions on Wendy and Hannah's faces. Wendy stopped chewing her pancake at once. Both girls looked confounded, and went almost deathly white. "How do you know?" Wendy said quite abruptly, looking at my mother accusingly as if to say, "Have you been spying on us or something?" It was my mother who then nearly choked on her pancake. You see, mentioning the ghost ship on her part had just been a joke. I was the one that stared at the two girls in confoundment now. They were joking, of course they were. There was no way on God's earth they'd seen the ghost ship, but somehow their expressions told me another story, and that they had. You cannot make up a look that those girls were wearing on their faces. If you could, you'd get an Academy Award for first-rate acting. I think those two girls at the best of times were pretty lousy at the performing arts, without wishing to be mean. The story they told us next was so outlandish and so remarkable that I almost spat out my food in shock. I knew unequivocally that they were not making the story up. You pretty much know when someone is telling a lie, and Hannah is the most useless liar I've ever met. I've known my sister all my life, and she's never been able to put a fast one on me, and even my parents know when she's spinning a big yarn. All right, I will admit, I was green with envy, and I'm not used to experiencing a reaction like that because I'm not by nature jealous. But can you blame me? My sister and Wendy had seen a ghost ship, And if that wasn't enough, they'd encountered 2 Bigfoot on the beach, all in one night. It's like winning the lottery twice over. My eyes were on stalks as I listened to their incredible story. I'm not going to kid. I almost hated them for their good fortune, and secretly wished that I had stopped them from going out in the middle of the night after all. I was privately pleased when my mother said, "I don't care what you saw on the beach, whether it was a ghost ship or 2 Bigfoot. But what I do care about is that last night you went out of the cliff house in treacherous conditions. There was quite the wind blowing out there last night. The house was rattling. But you both decide to go out in the middle of the night looking for a ghost ship when you could have been blown to your deaths." "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Leonora, dear," said my father Malachi. "They're both safe, are they not? And for God's sake, Leonora, they saw a ghost ship. And 2 Bigfoots told them you only see that once every 20 years. I'll say this about you. When you're around, Wendy, things happen. Remind me to get your ideas on what horses to pick the next time I go to the races," he teased. I turned around to look directly at Wendy, and I said, "What I don't understand is how you claim the Bigfoots talk to you. How could you possibly understand a word they were saying? And weren't you the slightest bit intimidated by their size? I've heard some hair-raising stories about Bigfoot encounters before, where people have been scared out of their wits. And you're telling me these creatures were all pally-wally with you?" Wendy looked heartily annoyed with my cursory comments, and physically frowned. "We're telling you what happened to us last night, Chester, and it's no skin off my nose if you don't believe me. I couldn't care a stuff if you don't. It happened. Get over it, will you?" "I never said I didn't believe you, Wendy," I said obsequiously. "Well, if you want to know how we understood the Bigfoots, it was because when they spoke to us, or when he spoke to us, in a foreign language, the translation was downloaded into our heads like one of those fancy computer apps, only super fast. You just knew the meaning of their words. That's how we knew." "It's true," said Hannah. "It's very hard to explain. They speak in an ancient language, and they seem to have these outer-worldly abilities." "What did they look like?" asked Leonora. "I cannot believe you spotted one on the beach, so close to our home." "We didn't spot one. We spotted 2, Wendy corrected my mother. She considered my mother's words. "The ones we encountered were so human, weren't they, Hannah? Very human." Hannah nodded. "They were titanic in size. I mean, we're talking about 8 to 9 foot tall, possibly 700 pounds or more. Very muscular, covered in long, flowing dark hair. I think they have their own unique faces like human beings do. I would recognize the both of them straight away, if I ever saw them again. They were friendly towards us, so of course we weren't afraid. It was like encountering a regular human being, only they were incredibly different. Besides, it was like there was a special connection between us as we all shared in this remarkable experience together. So I guess it kind of bonded us all. I hope we see them again," said Wendy wistfully. I wish I could have been happy for my sister and for Wendy, but I hasten to say I wasn't. I almost hated them for experiencing something so amazing, and that I'd missed out. And I was secretly determined that even though I had never got to see the ghost ship in some way, I would stop at nothing to find those Bigfoots. I must admit, I've always been a cynic. I would have never believed in the cryptic creatures before. But when you've been in the company of 2 people that have met the creatures, you know without a shadow of a doubt that they are real. By nature, I'm quite the slouch. I like to retire to bed early, and getting up in the middle of the night is not my idea of fun. But that had all changed exponentially for me after my sister's sighting of those Bigfoots. I was determined that I would be doing some nocturnal research all of my own, and one day I'd be sitting across the breakfast table with my incredulous story to tell Hannah, and she would envy me as much as I'd envied her. She had admitted she wished she'd run after the Bigfoots and talked to them more. They seemed to know a lot about the ghost ship. They had been sitting there on the beach, waiting for it to appear, like people who go to Alaska to observe the northern lights. I guess both me and Wendy, we were so shocked. It took us a long while to come to terms with what had happened that night, she had said. But by then the Bigfoots were long gone. It stands to reason that the Bigfoots would be more active at night, I had thought. So I called my friend from home to tell him my sister's incredible story, and to say he was shocked is an understatement. I had begged him over and over and over again to come and stay with me at the Cliff House, but he wasn't biting the bait. But that changed at once when I told him about the Bigfoots. Suddenly he couldn't come to the Cliff House fast enough.
This isn't a wind-up, bro, is it? You are telling me your sister Hannah and her friend Wendy got to see 2 Bigfoots and a ghost ship on the very same night? You are kidding me. That is insane.
I'm not winding you up, bro.
I know my sister is not making this up. Neither is Wendy. They're telling the absolute truth. I'd know if they were making it up. When can I come and stay? Were his very next words.
Oh, that is such fabulous news, my mother had said to me. I can't believe that Dylan is finally coming to stay with us at the Cliff House. You've asked him so many times. I thought he was rather reluctant because of all the suicides that happened on the cliff, and I thought he'd got cold feet. But to hear he's coming, well, that is such great news, isn't it? I never told my mother why Dylan was now an eager beaver to come and stay with us, but my mother's not stupid. I guess she secretly suspected what this was all about, but if she did, she wisely said nothing. As for my father, he gave me a knowing look and slapped me on the back and said,
"Don't be disappointed, son, if you and Dylan don't see a Bigfoot on the beach. Your sister got lucky, that's all. But remember, those creatures are naturally elusive by nature. Not many people get to see them. I hope you realize that."
I held up my hand to stop my father going on any more. I didn't need him robbing all my hopes with his doubts.
"Dad, forget it. I know what you're going to say, but don't say it. For your information, me and Dylan are going to find those Bigfoots that Hannah and Wendy saw. They are out there somewhere, and we'll find them."
My father looked at me sorrowfully, but wisely shut his mouth. I think I would have throttled him if he'd said,
"Son, I don't want you to be disappointed again."
I knew it was on the edge of his lips, but I gave him such a devilish look he knew he was treading on thorny ground if he dared suggest that me and Dylan would not get to see the Bigfoots. I was over the moon when Dylan arrived at the Cliff House. Of course he agreed that we lived on top of the world.
"This place is so cool," he said, "but I can see why people would come here to take their lives. That drop is dreadfully steep. You wouldn't survive a fall like that. Have there been any recent attempted suicides?"
"No, not recently," I said.
"Good," he said, "because I don't want to be around when someone is thinking of ending their lives. Imagine witnessing such an event," he said, shuddering. "Well, Dad's been able to talk them away from the cliff. He brings them back to the house for coffee." "Even so," said Dylan, "there's going to be those people you can't talk around."
I had never seen my friend Dylan so frenzied before. He was like a bee buzzing over a sweet can of Coca-Cola, and usually nothing got my friend hyped up. But the possibility that we might just encounter a Bigfoot, well, that had put the wind in his sails. In a good way, of course.
"Oh my God, bro," he said,
slapping me affectionately on my back.
"I feel it in my bones, don't you? You and me, we're going to see those Bigfoots."
I think even my parents noticed that Dylan seemed unusually animated over the dinner table, as his conversation was spirited and upbeat. And normally Dylan is not exactly much of a conversationalist. He tends to be rather quiet, subdued, and unassuming. But over dinner, on his arrival, he was like a bright firecracker that had been lit up and was ready to explode. My parents wisely said nothing, but I caught the sneaky exchange of looks between my mother and father. I guess they knew exactly why Dylan was here. I could have knocked my sister off her smug, condescending pedestal when she said with a haughty swagger, as if butter wouldn't melt in her mouth, "If you think you're going to encounter the Bigfoots that me and Wendy saw, I doubt it very much. We were just lucky, I guess." Little did my sister know that her pompous cursory remarks only made me and Dylan all the more determined to leave no stone unturned to find those Bigfoots my sister had seen. When my family retired to bed that night, I felt like a little boy all over again, with a treasure trove map in my hands. I think Dylan felt much the same. My heart was fluttering in my chest, as if a couple of trapped birds were flying inside me, looking for an escape. Dylan's eyes were shining like a kid, unable to wait for the exciting promise of a Christmas morning and a brand new toy train he was about to receive. Ostensibly it was like we were discussing where we would find the pirate's treasure, which in our case was not gold bullion, but of the hairy kind, you could say. We both sat up drawing a map of the area and the wooded areas close to the beach. We set our alarms, and in the nights that followed we were up and about, walking through wood groves and scaling beaches in the dead of night, in our frantic search for the cryptic creatures. I would be lying if I said after 5 consecutive nights of exhaustive searching, I was becoming increasingly more despondent of a successful outcome in finding those elusive creatures. When I saw my sister's haughty expression being replayed in my head, and her patronizing words, "I guess we were just lucky," it was like a catalyst to me, and my ebbing exhaustion would light up like a pilot light in a gas geyser, and I'd become more and more determined not to give up on our quest for the Holy Grail. One thing I will say about Dylan is when he has his mind set on something, he does not get easily discouraged. I doubt that for a single moment that he felt remotely despondent like I did. After a night of searching, he'd slap me on the back again and say, "Tomorrow we'll find those Bigfoots." It was on the 6th night of our nocturnal activity that our luck was about to change. I remember when Dylan was shaking me and telling me to wake up. There was a large part of me that wanted to say, "Forget it, bro. I just want to sleep in." But then my sister's annoying smug face would peer at me in my head and taunt me, like a mouse teasing the family cat. And she'd say, "I guess we were lucky." I'd bounce out of my bed faster than a March hare and get dressed into my jeans and sweatshirt at the speed of light. Believe me, I needed no further encouragement. Summer was looming closer, so the weather was becoming significantly warmer, but it can get quite cool at the Oregon coast, even in summer, and the water is not friendly for swimmers unless you're partial to swimming in ice-cold conditions, which are fiercely abhorrent in the late evening, when the temperatures plummet still further. I don't care how good it is supposed to be for your immune system. You won't get me dead in that water, not even wearing a wetsuit. We had planned to do all our searching when, of course, the beaches were accessible, when the tide is low. I'm not sure what time it was, but the cliff house was in a deep sleep. So like 2 furtive burglars, we surreptitiously crept through the house, and yes, there was a cool breeze blowing outside. But I'm glad that we didn't have to encounter those boisterous windy conditions my sister embraced on the night that she observed the ghost ship. Soon we were outside the house, and if my mother knew what we were up to, which I suspect she did, she wouldn't have blinked an eyelash. That's a good thing about being male. Your parents are just much more relaxed about what you get up to. I guess they think I can look after myself. And as for my father, well, he's the most carefree person you could ever hope to meet. It was a blissfully beautiful night. We were both wearing headlamps on our heads, but the full moon was fiercely generous and lit up everything in a pearly luminescence that was hauntingly ethereal. I've never known a night to be so light, and me and Dylan could see our way clearly down the long wrought-iron staircase that led to the rocky beach below. I barely noticed the cool breeze nuzzling at my skin and burrowing through my windbreaker. I'm not sure what our plan was for this evening. I guess we didn't have a plan, which may have been the very reason why our luck changed. Before long we were on the beach, staring at the sculptural rocks, like large slouching sea animals stretching out languidly across the sea sand, while the surf galloped elegantly to shore, like a herd of white Lipizzaner ponies. I remember for a brief moment just standing there on the beach, staring up at the full moon and the silvery sheen of light that trespassed so elegantly across the ocean. In that moment I wished I was an artist or a great photographer of some kind, because the night was almost outer-worldly. It was blissfully idyllic, and in that second being out here on the beach was 1,000 times better than being wrapped up in a cosy warm bed. The night beheld within its grasp a prepossessing magic. We could hear the sound of the breakers crashing violently against the rocks, smell the pronounced salt in the air. We observed a couple of large crabs scuttling across the sea sand. For once in our lives we were not hurrying up the long ribbon of beach looking for the lofty, ambiguous silhouettes of two Bigfoots. Instead, we were held to ransom by the incredible view, spellbound by its intoxicating allure. We had both abandoned our sneakers and were standing on a cool gargantuan rock, staring out towards the sea. And for some absurd reason, we just sat down, and we watched the effervescent sparkle of the night before us. For a moment I forgot about even why we were here. We were so caught up in this moment, my mind empty of any thoughts. It was like I had become one with the ocean spray, with the rocks, with the pearly moon, and Dylan was to tell me much later that he had felt much the same. That was when we saw it. At first I had no idea what I was seeing. It looked like something bulky and white, hammering into the side of a distant rock, as the waves thundered against it.
"What the hell is that?" I asked Dylan.
"I have no idea," said Dylan, following the direction of where I was pointing to. He shrugged his shoulders. The two of us instinctively bounded over towards the rock, and that was when we saw the figure of a girl, in a white jacket, floating on the water. She was dead, her body crushed and contorted at a very peculiar angle. She looked to be about our age. I knew at once that this was a girl who had come to the cliff house in the dead of night and thrown herself off the edge, and the ocean was almost washing her away.
"Bloody hell," said Dylan.
I just stared at the body incredulously. It was then we realized we were not alone. A male and female Bigfoot came charging over to us. The male Bigfoot dragged the deceased corpse out of the water. He then threw it over his shoulders like a sack of potatoes. The Bigfoots appeared to almost float across the beach sand. Their movements were so graceful. Me and Dylan followed the Bigfoots as if it was the most normal thing to do. Their focus had been removing the corpse of the girl from the water, and not really on us. Everything was so surreal. Once the Bigfoots had the girl safely secured at the edge of the beach, they weighed down her clothes with some stones so she wouldn't be easily swept away by the tide. The male Bigfoot looked up at us very thoughtfully, and then he looked directly at the moon. I noticed the female Bigfoot nodded, but she was not desperately chatty. She seemed bashful and reticent, but her beautiful brown eyes were so kind, so friendly, so warm. And as weird as this sounds, I think she was smiling at us. The male Bigfoot's voice boomed.
"Hantalakina ha sako solonapa, hilanikana kolonaba."
"Whenever the moon is full, this happens a lot more," he said sorrowfully.
"Tolompaki kakwasana."
"Emotions can be high at this time."
"Ho latilakana ham sanshan."
"So many lives lost," he said. He was speaking to us in a language which I would have never have understood, but his words were translated into English in our heads.
"Hotolapikani kasa hofaki."
"So many people jump from that cliff," he said.
"Hearts so filled with sadness."
"That's the problem with your kind."
"Hakilatilana hompasikasa."
"You carry the burdens and the weight of the world so heavily in your heart. Why do you do this to yourselves? What can be so dreadfully bad that you want to end it all?" The female Bigfoot nodded in agreement. She looked at me questioningly, as if she was expecting me to give her an answer. So I said,
"We live in the house on the cliff. My father stopped a lot of people from jumping to their deaths. If he had seen this girl tonight, he might have talked her around." "Galatinaqua."
"Not this one," said the male Bigfoot.
"Hilakinaquasana hopatila."
He'd never have talked her around.
"Hopati."
Some people cannot be helped. They have passed the stage of no return. You must tell your father that.
"How do you know about her?"
I asked the Bigfoots.
"Hilatinaqua hosankilanifo hatila."
I can read their energy. It lingers with her body. I feel the weight of her story, as tangibly as I feel the ocean spray upon my feet. So many losses in her life, far too many. First her mother, then her father. Now she has a miscarriage.
She didn't want to go on any more. She's at peace now, reuniting with those she has lost."
To my amazement, the female Bigfoot suddenly spoke and said, "Kolani kakwa, hosolopo." I'm glad your father answered the call. Many like him don't listen. "Tolopati, akisakwa." That's why you live on the cliff house. Nothing happens by chance. "Kolotolopa, hitinakwa." But some people don't receive their calling because they refuse to listen. Your father has listened. He has saved lives as a result, and he will save more. But he must remember, not all can be saved. "Talikakwa, holopotolo." I hope next time we meet, in more cordial circumstances. "Kitakwasi." Good to meet you both. Then it was the male who spoke to us, and he looked at us with the warmest, most beautiful eyes I've ever seen.
"Galanitwa, hosakatalanapo. We must go before the tide changes its course. Hilanitako. I think you need to get this girl's body to safety."
I nodded. I wanted to ask the Bigfoots questions, but they had both glided away before I could. But I knew what had happened was absolutely incredible. I watched them moving across the rocks until they were all but an inscrutable dot on the landscape that any passing observer might have thought was a couple of lofty trees.
"Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God!"
said Dylan, throwing his fists in the air excitedly.
"They came to us, not the other way round."
He let out a laugh.
"My God, that's hilarious. We've been looking for them everywhere, and then, of all things, they come to us. I cannot believe it. Can you believe how human they were? They understood exactly what we were saying, and they weren't scary despite their gargantuan size."
"We can talk about our encounter with the Bigfoots later," I told him, reminding Dylan of the deceased corpse of the poor girl on the beach.
"We don't want her to be washed away."
It was incredible for us, at a point of such tragedy, that our dreams in meeting the Bigfoot were fully realized. Me and Dylan hurriedly charged back home to call the emergency services, and before long the beach was flooded with emergency workers and people shaking their heads sadly. One EMT said,
"I wonder why she did this, poor mite."
I said to him,
"Well, I guess she lost her mother and father. Then she had a miscarriage. Things got on top of her."
The emergency worker and his friend looked confounded.
"How do you know all this?" the one man asked me. "Call it a gut feeling," I said. "Are you psychic?" asked the EMT. "In a manner of speaking," I said, walking away determined that I was not going to tell the men about the Bigfoots I'd encountered. So there we are. That's the end of part 4 of our story. Part 5 is tomorrow night, and I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.